Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all here to Birkbeck this evening. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism here at Birkbeck, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all to this event on race, equality, and the law, occasioned by the 50th anniversary of the first Race Relations Act in the UK, which was passed in 1965. This event this evening, I'd like to mention as well, is not only a Pears event, but it's also a part of Birkbeck's Social Science Week of events, a week dedicated to the theme of race and diaspora. Last night there was a showing of the film The Stuart Hall Project, and tomorrow night is a lecture by Professor Les Back from Goldsmiths College entitled For a Sociological Reconstruction, a W.E.B. Du Bois, Stuart Hall, and Segregated Sociology. And that's not the only partnership that we have for this evening, because the inspiration for this evening's event, the proposal that we should have this event, came from Dr. Edie Friedman, the founder and executive director of the Jewish Council for Racial Equality. And I'll ask Edie to say a few words in a moment. I just want to say, before introducing our other speakers, I just want to say a couple of words about race relations law in the UK. I suppose what the series of race relations acts that we have in the UK passed in 1965, 68, and 1976 mark out is, I think, a peculiarly British way of dealing with issues of racial inequality. That's not a value judgment, just to say it's different from the way the legal regime in the United States, which introduced affirmative action, and or from the regime in France, for example, which simply did not legislate on the subject. It's interesting that when James Callaghan, who was then Home Secretary, introduced the second reading of the 1968 Race Relations Act, which was an act which was sort of introduced at the high moment of Powellism in the UK. The second reading of the act occurred on St. George's Day, and James Callaghan, not a politician noted for his rhetorical flourishes, all the same had a rhetorical flourish on that day and placed the the bill that he was proposing in a tradition of British radicalism and reform, which started with the 1832 Reform Act, continued through the suffragettes, and was to have its third incarnation in the race relations bill that he was proposing. Of course, the fact that he had to say that is only underscores, in a way, the way in which that legislation was highly contested. Did it have a place in the British political tradition or not? Well, we have three tremendous authorities and speakers to discuss that question and others this evening. After we hear from Edie, we'll hear from Camilla Schofield, speaking on the history of race relations and the Race Relations Acts. Camilla is lecturer in imperial history at the University of East Anglia and is the author of Enoch Powell and the Making of Post-Colonial Britain. After Camilla, we will hear from Dr. Anastasia Vakulenko from the University of Birmingham. Anastasia is lecturer in the Birmingham Law School, and her book, Islamic Veiling in Legal Discourse, was published in June 2012. And after that, we will hear from Dr. Omar Khan. Omar is director of the Runnymede Trust, really a leading think tank in the UK on issues of racial inequality, and he sits on the Department for Work and Pensions Ethnic Minority Advisory Group and has published many articles and reports on political theory, a political history, and speaks on multiculturalism, integration, and social and economic disadvantage. But before our main speakers come up this evening, I just would like to invite Edie Friedman from JCOR.
Thank you very much, David. Can you hear me in the back? First, if I could just say a few brief words about JCOR, the Jewish Council for Racial Equality. It's an organization that endeavors to provide a Jewish voice on race and asylum issues, working in three main areas: anti-racism education, Black, Asian, Jewish dialogue, and refugee and asylum issues. To complement some of the specific areas we'll be covering this evening, I just wanted to raise a few broad questions, which I hope will be useful. Our discussions this evening are important to not only remind ourselves about the origins of this legislation and how it impacts specifically on Muslim and Jewish communities in 2015, but what do we do next? So a few questions. First, has anti-racism, other than Islamophobia and anti-Semitism, fallen off the political and activist agenda? And turning to the 1965 Act itself, how do we convince a somewhat reluctant population that the 1965 Act is part of a tradition which Britain should take a lot of pride in? How do we recapture some of the idealism that helped to create this legislation, even though we live in very different times from 1965? And finally, how do we make the 65 Act and subsequent legislation alive and meaningful for the younger generation who have always lived with equality legislation, so that this generation feels the commitment to defend and strengthen equality and human rights today? Thank you.
Thanks for having me today. Thank you to the Institute for inviting me to speak, particularly Professor David Feldman. I'm going to speak about the history of race relations and specifically race relations law. I'm going to confine my talk mostly to a discussion of the two Race Relations Acts of the 1960s, 1965 and 68. And I believe Anastasia is going to touch on the history of the 1976 Act, so that's great. What I wanted to do today was to think about two approaches to the history of race relations in Britain. The first, exemplified by the work of Bailkin, Steinmetz, sees this history as part of the expansion and reach of sociology. Through this approach, it's possible to unearth the transnational and sometimes imperial roots of discourses of race relations and liberal tolerance in Britain. The second understands race relations as a key part of the reformist social democratic state of the 1960s, most readily associated with the so-called permissive legislation of the period. Today, I want to argue that race relations law marks an important conjuncture between social science expertise and state-led modernization. And in practice, the Race Relations Project provides us with a significant window not only into these sociological ideas and policies, but also into how individuals engaged with and made sense of this new role of the state, providing some individuals, at least, with a particular language to articulate inequality. Before I go on to this, I should, outline something of the laws. So 50 years ago, a Labour government passed the first Race Relations Act. This act made it unlawful to refuse service, for instance, the service of eating in a restaurant, staying in a hotel, or drinking in a pub, to a member of the public because of their race, colour, or national origin. This law, to a limited extent, protected the individual consumer. 3 years later, it was expanded to make the rampant discrimination in housing and employment in Britain unlawful too. The 1965 Act was described by lawyers at the time as, quote, a radical departure. Critically, both those who supported and opposed the Act saw it as a radical break from the tradition of neutrality and passivity of the English legal system. Here was the law, the state, attempting to mould the standards of behaviour within the market. To its opponents, discrimination meant choice. And in principle, the common law had tended to favour the maintenance of the widest possible ambit of choice or freedom of contract. Lawyers at the time insisted that, in principle, this freedom of contract had been maintained until 1965. Unlike the United States, prior to British race relations law, there was no legal obligation on employers to maintain equality of opportunity, pay, or promotion. That was the job of unions. Similarly, in housing, there had been no obligation to private landlords to treat renters equally. The forces of the market were, in a sense, left free to play and had continued to produce what some called the coloured tax in housing, credit, and insurance. Even more, by the mid-1960s, it was clear that unionism had absolutely failed to protect black workers. According to Enoch Powell, the 1965 and 68 Race Relations Acts were essentially fascist, in that they signalled the state's dangerous effort to police the heart and soul of individuals, depriving the individual of the freedom to discriminate in the free market. This was repeated in the Times in 68, which noted that the fear of the white community is that there would be too much interference by authority into their ordinary way of life, unquote. As one of the drafters of the legislation, Cedric Thornberry, put it in 1965, quote, with the decline of ecclesiastical power and religious observance and the beginnings of the development of secular, urbanized communities and rapid social change, Parliament, through legislation, has taken over and developed the role once filled by the Church. This was the modern and moral interventionist state. The 1965 law built on the Public Order Act of 1936, making it a criminal offence to incite racial hatred, or more specifically, racial violence. But this was far less controversial and radical than its efforts to control racist, though often widely socially acceptable, forms of everyday discrimination between individuals. Rather than criminal sanction in discrimination cases, though, the Home Secretary, Frank Soskis, disarmed critics of the bill with the compromise that unlawful discrimination would carry no criminal offence, but would be a civil matter and would be dealt with through a conciliation process. This was, as one legal scholar put it, a process of pacification rather than criminal sanction. Borrowing methods from American employment tribunals, race relations legislation instituted local and national committees to help resolve disputes between citizens. The papers of these committees offer a rich and untapped vein of post-war social history. They tell a story of individuals' understandings of how both fair play in the market and the role of the state in its protection. Community members would visit households, hold interviews, and write detailed reports on the individuals involved. Many of these committee members were immigrants or were the children of immigrants. Though originally a voluntary service, these committees, these conciliation officers, represent, I'd argue, the beginnings of a new professional type, representing an emerging area of social expertise, coming from a wide array of fields such as social work, management, and community activism. This was, as some would derisively describe it, the expansion or institution of the race relations industry. The 1964 law was then, according to the British law profession, at least a radical departure. Through local conciliation boards, race relations law sought to define and structure community relations in Britain. In arguments in favour of the original bill, emphasis was placed on these local conciliation committees as, quote, invaluable opportunities for members of immigrant communities to extend and expand their experience of public work and public service. As John Hunt, MP for West Bromley, put it, this would lead to the, quote, the development of experienced and responsible leadership within the coloured community, unquote. Even more, these laws represented a key moment of progressive legislation on which subsequent laws barring discrimination based on ethnicity, sex, gender, and religion were built. Behind the 1965 Act stood the combined efforts of black activists like the West Indian doctor David Pitt, white liberal politicians such as Fenner Brockway, academics linked to the Institute of Race Relations such as Philip Mason, who advised on the sources of, quote, racial feeling and the possibilities of social reform, and finally a committee of lawyers, the Society of Labour Lawyers, who drafted the bill, along with a number of other progressive laws drafted in the period. In this sense, these laws have a political, intellectual, and legal history. Why then, we should ask, is the Race Relations Act of 1965 so easily forgotten? Why is this such a quiet anniversary? Why is it largely absent from Britain's national story of the post-war years? Why does it seem to have no champion? For the rest of the talk, I'd like to speak to this question, and in doing so point to new ways of incorporating and engaging with the history of race relations law in Britain. As I see it, as I said, there are two ways forward that I think can be pursued simultaneously. One is the fashionable way forward, seeing this history as a part of the expansion of sociology, the reach of sociology. Through this, it's possible to unearth the transnational and imperial roots of liberal tolerance in Britain, like debates around multiculturalism, race relations in the 1960s was top on the international agenda. The other way forward in the history of race relations is less fashionable, but I think just as essential. I want to argue that race relations law, and even the concept of race relations, should be squarely placed within the history of the post-war state. It is one aspect, I'd argue, of a constellation of laws that sought to modernise social life in post-war Britain, alongside the Sexual Offences Act, the Abortion Act, the Divorce Reform Act, as well as later equalities legislation. More broadly, these race relations laws signal, as I said, a historical conjuncture where we see the state and law increasingly influenced by sociology and promises of state-led modernisation. This was a marriage of expertise that did not die, but took on new purpose in the neoliberal era. There are, I think, clear and compelling reasons why the Race Relations Acts of 65 and 68 are not embraced as a triumph of the left and not remembered on par with the Equal Pay or Sex Discrimination Acts, for instance. There are compelling reasons why this is a quiet anniversary. For one, the acts are rightly remembered as a sugar coating to the bitter pill of racially motivated immigration legislation. The first Race Relations Act coincided with the Labour government's white paper on immigration, which officially embraced the need for restrictive immigration law. The 1968 Act coincided with the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of that year. Many viewed both acts as an attempt on the part of the Labour Party to appear moderate and progressive while pandering to popular opposition to black immigration. Secondly, the Race Relations Act fits awkwardly into histories of anti-racism. For one, they lack a historic moment of popular democratic support. They are often written as top-down history. Unlike America's civil rights movement, there was no equivalent to the March on Washington to precede and popularise the meaning of Britain's race relations laws. Even more, black activists who lobbied for the acts through the short-lived campaign against racial discrimination, such as David Pitt, was seen by the late 1960s as establishment figures, middle class, middle of the road, behind the times, and too willing to merely support a white liberal agenda. And this sense that race relations discourse reflected a white liberal agenda, reflecting on efforts to manage and depoliticize social tensions rather than a triumph of anti-racist activism, points to another reason why the acts are rarely emphasized as a triumph on the left. The name race relations gives it away. The historian Paul Rich was the first to draw the links between race relations expertise in Britain and South Africa. More recently, the work of George Steinmetz and Jordana Bailkin have linked the strength of sociology and race relations in 1950s and 1960s Britain to late colonial Africa, concerning migration, urbanisation, and labour relations. The history of Britain's Institute of Race Relations dramatises these connections and their relationship to later anti-racist activism. The Institute was founded in 1950 by ex-colonial servants and business interests with investment in the developing world, concerned about the threats of racial conflict to Britain's economic interests. The Ford Foundation, the Africa Private Enterprise Group, including Barclays and the mining firm Rio Tinto, founded some of the Institute's first research projects in tropical Africa. In 1950, it turned for the first time to research relations in Britain after the race riots. Looking through the Institute of Race Relations journals, research on South Africa and the United States, Kenya and Rhodesia appear dotted between research into race in Britain. As Steinmetz has emphasized, race relations research reflected a turn from anthropological research in the colonies, focused on understanding and protecting stationary and discrete ethnic cultures, towards what was seen as a more modern sociological outlook, concerned with social change, population movement, modernization, and the social consequence of capital investment in the developing world. But critically, this colonial past, or its associations with managing social conflict and working in the interests of government and private enterprise, rather than any association with the politics of liberation, would contribute to radical criticisms of the Institute by the end of the 1960s. In 1972, there was a revolution from within the Institute. The radical theorist Sivanandan took over as director, and it developed a distinctly Marxist agenda, profoundly influenced by black liberation thought and global politics. Much like Wendy Brown's recent criticisms of toleration discourse, Sivanandan and others articulated a rejection of the liberal race relations project. The acts were, to an extent, part of that disavowed and disinherited generation. According to radical critics, the act's conciliation process was not a means of black participation, but in practice paternalistic and depoliticizing. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, on top of the history of division in anti-racism between the liberal establishment and new radical politics of the 1970s, the acts are not remembered as a triumph because, to a great extent, they failed. Cedric Thornberry, as early as 1965, referred to the failure to criminalize discrimination as, quote, a sad, botched-up job, reflecting little credit to anyone who was involved in it, including himself. In the era of discrimination, in those few years, the numbers speak for themselves. Between 1966 and 1968, the National Race Relations Board heard 327 complaints of racial discrimination. These are those cases recognized as legitimate by local community relations commissions and passed on to the National Board. Of those 327, only 4 were then referred to the Attorney General for possible civil action. The Attorney General found a reason to not proceed in all 4 cases. The 1968 Act was only marginally more effective. Only a handful of cases in employment and housing were taken to court by the board during the entire lifetime of the 1968 Act, and damages were extremely small. In 1968, when the Daily Mirror surveyed ethnic minorities on their hopes and confidence in the new Race Relations Act, 85% believed that whites would find loopholes in the law and it would prove ineffective. They were right. Again and again, the National Board erred on the side of non-intervention. Despite this, I'd like to make a final point, that there is room to begin to tell a history of these laws and the programme of race relations from the bottom up and within a larger political frame that moves beyond this story of failure and moves beyond top-down discourses of race. For starters, we need to people the machinery of the Race Relations Project. They were, of course, part of a bigger machinery of the state, but we need to look to the volunteers and professionals who ran the conciliation councils over the years. Their records are full of judgments of character and class-bound assumptions. We might consider how individual lives intersected with this role of conciliation. For instance, I've looked into the life of one Labour councillor who witnessed Oswald Mosley's speeches in West London in the late 50s, who went on to spend a decade working in development and charity work in Tanzania, Mauritius and Bangladesh, before returning to serve as a consolation officer in Brixton. Even more, we need to also see the ways that individuals attempted to make claims through this legislation against everyday racism, often beyond the limits of the law in practice. For instance, we might tell the story of the Polish national, Mr. Zesko, who was denied housing in Ealing because the council required applicants to be British. He made a case that this was discrimination, which was declined on the grounds, remarkably, that the law's prohibition of national origins was not meant to refer to nationality. Or Mr. Selvajaran, a physics teacher from India living in London, who was denied promotion despite having more experience than the successful candidate by the Inner London Education Authority because his personality wasn't right for the role of a careers advisor. When the Race Relations Board found against Selvajaran, he took civil action against the board itself. Or Mr. Hughes, an Irish Catholic, who worked on the Great Western Railway for 10 years, and when his wife had a child that was denied a house through the Great Western Housing Association, it was not his Irishness and his Catholicness that was the problem. This is early 1970s. The Race Relations Board found that he was a troublemaker. All these stories, I'd argue, point to the contested meaning of discrimination and equality of opportunity at this time. They tell stories of social aspiration and lost opportunities and of living as tolerated subjects. To conclude, the history of the Race Relations Act of 65 and 68 should not be defined only by a story of failure, nor should these laws only be treated as a window into top-down representations of community, ethnicity, or race within sociology and the law. In other words, we can read these cases against the grain, through the thousands of cases of individuals claiming equality through legal process, and through volunteers and professionals who made up the machinery of the Race Relations Project, we find another political story. Not a radical or an activist history, but a history of everyday multiculturalism. Even more, this is a window, I'd argue, not just into the history of race in Britain, but a key window into popular beliefs about inequality, opportunity, and the rights of citizenship. Thanks.
Hello. Well, I also want to thank the organisers for inviting me. I have been asked to talk about Jews, Muslims and the law. Well, the very topic itself perhaps highlights a slight shift away from the historical reasons for the introduction of the first Race Relations Act as helpfully outlined by Camilla. However, I will try to stick to my brief and focus on Jews and Muslims, as these are indeed two groups that raise some important issues about race relations today. Of course, it's impossible to do justice to that topic in 15 minutes. I'll try. I'll give a quick overview of the development of the law in these particular areas, and I'll start with the Race Relations Act, but more recently the law has expanded into equality law more generally and human rights law. So when I talk about the law, it's a wider picture that I'll be talking about. So this overview will hopefully show that although much has been achieved, and indeed Britain is often praised as having decent equality laws, there's still room for improvement, with both Muslims and Jews perhaps feeling that the law could protect them better. As I said, neither Jews nor Muslims were the impetus behind the introduction of the first Race Relations Act in 1965. Those groups were just not at the forefront of the agenda at the time. But as I said at present, they are central to much of the legal controversy revolving around race, religion, equality, and human rights. They're both groups with complex identity in which race cannot be neatly separated from culture and religion, which our secular law does seem to insist upon, as it deals with various protected characteristics. So generally you have to choose either race or religion when you're claiming discrimination. The 1965 Race Relations Act was indeed a weak piece of legislation. It was eventually replaced with the Race Relations Act 1976, which prohibited discrimination on the grounds of race, color, nationality, ethnic and national origin in the fields of employment, the provision of goods and services, education, and public function. Today, this has been consolidated by the Equality Act 2010. However, back in the early 80s, the House of Lords elaborated on the concept of an ethnic group under the Act, so that, quote, for a group to constitute an ethnic group, it must regard itself and be regarded by others as a distinct community by virtue of certain characteristics. Such characteristics included a shared history, a cultural tradition, a common geographical origin, a common descent, a common language, a common literature, a common religion, and being a minority or a dominant group within a larger community. So this definition from the House of Lords in the case of Mandla and Dawal Lee has come to define how both Jews and Muslims had to fit themselves into discrimination law. Already 35 years ago, Jews were recognized as the archetypal ethnic group by law. This was important for practical purposes because religious discrimination was not outlawed at the time. Up until 2003, it was allowed to discriminate on the basis of religion. That meant that a Jewish claimant could only bring a case arguing race, but not religious discrimination. The essentially racial, in inverted commas, nature of Jewishness was summed up by the famous eccentric English judge Lord Denning in 1982. And that was in a case which did not concern Jews at all. It was a case about Sikhs. Lord Denning says, a Jew may mean a dozen different things. It may mean a man of the Jewish faith, or it may mean a man of Jewish parentage, even though he may be a convert to Christianity. The Jewish blood may have become very thin by intermarriage with Christians, but still many would call him a Jew. All this leads me to think that when it is said of the Jews that they're an ethnic group, it means that the group as a whole share a common characteristic, which is a racial characteristic. End of quote. Many would find this definition highly objectionable, of course, but it provided a practical benefit to the Jews in the sense that it allowed them, at least in theory, to benefit from the race relations legislation back in the early 80s when religious discrimination was not outlawed. Muslims did not fare as well under that old legislation. They were not protected as Muslims under the 1966 Race Relations Act, as they were considered to be a purely religious rather than ethnic group. Islam, like Christianity, were considered to be multi-ethnic religions, unlike Judaism and Sikhism, for example. So a Muslim could only benefit from race relations legislation indirectly. For example, if he or she could show that some policy affecting Muslims also particularly affected Asians, because most Muslims would be of Asian origin. There has been much criticism of this thinking that postulates that discrimination against Muslims is a purely religious matter. There have been convincing theories that see Islamophobia as prejudice against Muslims on cultural and racial rather as well as religious grounds. With the introduction of the Human Rights Act in 1998 and the latest Equality Act in 2010, the categorization of Muslims as a religious rather than ethnic group is now of less practical significance because a Muslim claimant can now benefit from religious discrimination law as well as from the right to religious freedom under Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights. However, this purported distinction between race and religion still plays an important part on the practical level as well, because adverse treatment based on religion may not be viewed as seriously as adverse treatment based on race. Muslims have brought a considerable number of human rights and discrimination cases, generating some important case law. In these, Islamic dress has been very prominent, although by no means the only issue. Many will remember the case of Shabina Begum, who took her school to court for not allowing her to wear a jilbab, a long overall garment covering the entire body. In 2006, the majority of the House of Lords said that even if her freedom of religion were engaged, the school uniform rules were justified because of community cohesion and the fact that the school already allowed hijabs to be worn with the uniform, while jilbabs were clearly a minority practice. In this way, Shabina's issue was cast not as one of race or ethnic discrimination, but as an individual right to freedom of religion, which could then be sacrificed to community cohesion. The mainstream, so-called liberal version of Islam was accommodated by the school, but Shabina's was not, which does seem to sit at odds with the liberal tradition of individual freedom. And again, that resonates interestingly with what Camilla was saying about the individualist objection to race relations legislation back in the 60s. Just last week, a case was reported of a Muslim woman who was asked if she could wear a shorter jilbab whilst working at nursery. She lost the case, and perhaps I would agree with the outcome, but not with the reasoning of the judge, who dismissed her claim that her religion was engaged at all. Perhaps it would have been wiser to acknowledge that that policy does affect Muslims. However, it is justified in view of protecting the health and safety of the children. The judgment does indeed mention that, but more as an afterthought. As to Jews, as I said, they have long been considered the archetypal ethnic group, even if religion is also a big part of it. As I said earlier, this gave them an advantage as they were able to engage the race discrimination law at a time when religious discrimination was still allowed. Yet, as Didi Herman points out, this advantage remained purely theoretical, as there was not a single Jewish claimant in England who won a discrimination case on the grounds of his or her Jewishness up until the notorious JFS judgment in 2009. And as far as I know, there has not been a successful Jewish claim since. Herman has also written on the subtly disturbing racializing dynamics at play in English judgments concerning Jews, but I haven't got time to elaborate on that. The JFS case was not a straightforward success story. It involved a claim against the Jewish free school in London that refused to admit a boy because his mother's conversion to Judaism was not orthodox. The boy was not recognized by the school as Jewish. The Supreme Court found that the school's admission policy was based on a racial rather than religious criterion and was thus unacceptable. The judgment had important ramifications for any religious group's ability to define its own membership, any racial or ethnic criteria now being explicitly illegal. An interesting aspect of the judgment, though, is that the boy and his parents considered himself to be Jewish and clearly wanted to attend a Jewish school. That was the whole point for them. The boy was excluded because the school had its own version of Jewishness. So, although technically a Jewish claimant there won a race discrimination claim, this was against the Jewish school, which was found guilty of discriminating against those it perceived as being not Jewish. More recently, freedom of expression issues have affected both Muslims and Jews, and that goes to the question of how a wide cross-selection of law and not just race equality legislation affects these two groups. The Charlie Hebdo affair this January highlighted the sense of offense many Muslims experience as a result of unfettered speech attacking Islam and Muslims. Much of the Je suis Charlie campaign in the aftermath of the murders in Paris advocated the right to be offensive as an intrinsic part of the Western tradition and perhaps an indispensable part of the war on terror. On the other side of the spectrum, there is a perception that Muslims get a particularly bad deal out of freedom of expression in the West, often pointing out that Jews get better treatment because Holocaust denial is generally considered unacceptable in the law. Yet, however justifiable one sense of offense at lampooning depictions of the Prophet may be, many would attest that Holocaust denial is not a straightforward moral equivalent. Last night, an event entitled The Islamophobic University was held here at Bergbeck. The event was designed to interrogate, quote, the way in which free speech has been increasingly instrumentalized for Islamophobic ends. According to the event organizers, at the same time, there is a literal policing of the speech of Muslim students on university campuses, encapsulated in the UK Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015, which places a statutory duty on universities to prevent radicalism. In view of the pervasive Islamophobia, it is likely that this act will have a disproportionate and discriminatory effect on Muslim students. End of quote. I believe there is much truth to this assessment. Yet at the same time, many Jewish students and academics would testify to a growing sense of vulnerability and isolation they experience around anti-Israel activism on campus. A sense definitely exacerbated by events in the Middle East, which I think finally started to seep through into mainstream press, that kind of sense of being targeted. As far as the sticky question of anti-Israel activism is concerned, much of the discourse is impervious to any nuanced discussion of how anti-Jewish prejudice may be implicated. As seen in axiomatic assertions such as Judith Butler's, it is not anti-Semitic to be critical of Israel. Whilst, of course, criticism of Israel is not always anti-Semitic, it certainly can be. It is strange to let potential perpetrators themselves decide whether or not they're biased. This would never be acceptable with sexism or indeed other forms of racism. Yet that seems to go unchallenged in regards to anti-Jewish prejudice. Sadly, this attitude is now reflected in case law, the case in point being Fraser and University and College Union, 2013, in which a Jewish member of the union brought a claim alleging that their persistent advocacy of boycotts of Israel amounted to institutional racial harassment relating to his Jewishness, with a strong attachment to Israel being a non-contingent and rationally intelligible aspect of his Jewish identity. Perhaps predictably, Fraser lost his claim, and I personally don't see how any different outcome could have been reached, But what is particularly concerning is the tribunal's language. The claim was dismissed in its entirety as manifestly unmeritorious. According to the judgment, we greatly regret that the case was ever brought. At heart, it represents an impermissible attempt to achieve a political end by litigious means. The judge also stated that the union's behavior was not connected in any way whatsoever with Fraser's Jewishness, and that, quote, a belief in the Zionist project or an attachment to Israel is not intrinsically a part of Jewishness, end of quote. It is strange that the judge felt qualified to pass judgment in this way. Many Jews will, of course, consider attachment to Israel to be an intrinsic part of what they understand to be Jewish. So, what emerges, I think, from all this is a rather fragmented picture. What I see in all this is two separate realities almost, in which both Jews and Muslims attempted to consider themselves to be the most aggrieved minority of today. There's perhaps a deepening sense of isolation and exasperation in both communities, with Muslims being portrayed as radical extremists and Jews as associates of a rogue apartheid state. Sadly, there's considerable animosity between the two groups, and what I see in academia and politics is that there are two camps that do not seem to be talking to each other. So the challenge, I suppose, is how to maintain some sense of the bigger picture and not to fall into the trap of these partisan politics. In my view, there are opportunities for engagement for both groups in common issues. And what I have in mind is practices such as circumcision and ritual slaughter, both being considered minority practices which are not popular with the majority. It is perhaps in such cross-cutting issues that alliances could be formed to challenge the bias of the law that affects us all. And I conclude that.
For those of you who don't know, the Runnymede Trust is a think tank founded in 1968 and very much somewhat in the crucible of that period, and I suppose somewhat replacing the liberal institutional version of CARD, and somewhat in opposition to IRR. But I'm not going to go over that history. I've been asked to talk about the future, but happy to talk about it in questions, because I think Camilla's done an excellent job. But before I begin, I wanted to say something about the uses and abuses of Magna Carta, because it is, of course, the 800th, and appropriately, I hope, for an organization that's named after the field in Runnymede, where the document was sealed between king and barons 800 years ago. Most of the articles of the Magna Carta have long been superseded in many, many acts over the years. But the principle that a monarch's authority or the state's authority needs to be checked, and that privileges and rights should extend beyond the aristocracy, are ones that we rightly view as underpinning our own liberal democracies many centuries later. When the Runnymede Trust was founded in 1968, then, as we've heard, equal rights were still not a reality. By affirming that legacy of the Magna Carta, the founders of Runnymede were highlighting how ending racial discrimination was a further interpretation of that historic document and principles, but also indicating why those principles needed further legislation, further policy, and further social change to become a reality. This then brings us to the 50th anniversary of the Race Relations Act, Britain's first attempt to make the principles of Magna Carta a reality for the country's black and minority ethnic citizens. We have heard already how further major pieces of legislation have since been passed in 68, 1976, 2000, and 2010, indicating the importance of ensuring that democratic principles are indeed implemented. But also, I think that governments often do so only in response to social change and civil society pressure from below, whether those are anti-racist activists, whether indeed those are barons in Runnymede, Chartists, suffragettes, or the Caribbean response to racist attacks in West London in the 1950s that we now know as Notting Hill Carnival. Remember that following the 1965 Act, the one that was arguably implemented from above, those infamous signs of no blacks, no Irish, no dogs were still legal. They were still legal after the implementation of the first Race Relations Act, perhaps indicating why it's not always such a celebratory moment. Whatever changes in British social attitudes on race over the intervening decades, I would argue, they should therefore be traced as much in the hard work and struggles of ordinary migrants, black and indeed white people fighting against racism, as we should trace them to liberal legislators recognizing the moral truth of equal rights for all. 50 years on from the race relations legislation, coming to my speech proper, passed in Britain, the popular press, our political leaders, and public debate all affirm that we have overcome racism. We are in a post-racial society. Rather than diagnosing how we got to this lamentable position, it's more productive for me to outline 3 challenges we need to overcome to get beyond it, and some tentative ideas for doing so. The first challenge I call the challenge of analysis. Evidence continues to show significant racial inequalities in the UK. Over 100 black people have been murdered since the death of Stephen Lawrence. There are just 17 out of 20,000 black female professors. Black and Asian students need better marks in their A-levels to get into university. Half of Bangladeshi men earn less than £7 an hour. Violence against Jews and Muslims is rising, and the entire Muslim population is framed as a 5th column. However, the nature of ethnic inequalities does now vary, with some groups now doing well in some areas. For example, Chinese and Indian pupils in our schools. We can rebut dishonest uses of this evidence that seeks to deny that racism exists in any form by pointing out that even Indian and Chinese pupils are less likely to get into British universities with equivalent A-level results, and that despite these higher A-levels, they are less likely to get a first. They earn less in their first graduate jobs, and indeed 5-10 years later, and they are also still subject to racist abuse, harassment, and of course, sometimes even violence on the street. But we must, too, recognize that the changing evidence on race has led to some confusion regarding our analysis, why I call it the challenge of analysis, of the cause and experience of racial justice today. This can be seen in our shifting terminology in describing the issue since the 1990s. I won't go back further than that, but we could have a discussion about how there was a concept such as politically black in the 1970s and 80s that is now probably incomprehensible to anyone under 30 in the room. On the one hand, terminology is becoming more expansive, from black and minority ethnic, BME, the sort of term that we use, to black, Asian, and minority ethnic, BAME, and some people are even confused does the A stand for and. On other occasions, the issue is described in terms of ethnic minorities. These twin shifts are symptomatic, I think, of our difficulty in confronting directly the fact that our collective experience of race in Britain has indeed changed from 1965 or 1976, even as some things, including inequalities in the labor market, remain the same. Neither of these shifts, i.e. to BAME or to ethnic minorities, more expansively or more narrowly, more expansively or more encompassing groups other than non-white groups, neither of these shifts, I think, has explicitly fostered a new conceptualization of race or anti-racism. While the BAME category indicates the increasingly various experience of non-white people, the term ethnic minorities allows for analysis of white ethnic minorities, Jewish, Irish, and now Eastern European people, all of whom experience prejudice. However, the strength in the shift to ethnic minorities is also a weakness. Namely, it doesn't allow us to highlight the particular difficulties that non-white groups experience, still less to deplore more critical terms such as institutional racism or white privilege. Confusion regarding how to adapt our analysis to respond both to the changing nature of ethnicity or race in Britain, as well as the continued salience of color-based racism and ethnic inequalities in the labor market and elsewhere, partly explains why race has moved off the agenda, which is not just an issue of categories and analysis, but of mobilization and policy, the second 2 challenges. So moving to the second challenge, the challenge of mobilization, or activism, whatever you want to call it. There are now 8 million black and minority ethnic people living in the UK. That's equivalent to the combined population of Scotland and Wales. However, BME voters appear to have less power than nationalist parties in Scotland and Wales, or even the relatively minuscule DUP in Northern Ireland, and appear unable to shift the political debate or adapt policy even where racial inequalities are persistent. The shifting analysis I've just described is partly a response to this different mobilization amongst various ethnic groups, and so the relatively weaker political power of BME people collectively. Not only do some Asian groups not identify as politically black in the way that they would have done, well, many would have done in the 70s and 80s, but many have even come to reject the term Asian, too, preferring Indian, Bangladeshi, Muslim, Chinese, Hindu, or Thai identities, and mobilizing collectively on those grounds. And it's, of course, not just Asian groups that identify based on their national origins. The same is true also for many Nigerians, Brazilians, Jamaicans, various white minority ethnic groups, while some more recent arrivals may instead identify as migrants. Rather than bemoan this diverse mobilization, I think I'm going to follow the previous speaker and say we should recognize the ways that people currently mobilize and that some groups may prioritize different issues. But given the relatively small population of each community and their vulnerability to discrimination, there is an opportunity and need to bring these groups together on a wider platform. However, as Runnymede learned in a campaign we ran last year and the year before called End Racism This Generation, that involved a lot of public engagement work, including me leafleting on the street saying, "Is your area racist?" It's not easy to build and sustain a common position or mobilization around race. For many young black and minority ethnic people, or for already committed activists, an analysis that focuses on white privilege and institutional racism isn't simply an academic argument, but a descriptive reality for them, both economically and emotionally. However, such terms often make less experienced but sympathetic participants uncomfortable, and not only white British people or liberals. One of the many unfortunate consequences of the mainstream view that we live in a post-racial society is that perfectly reasonable assessments of the nature of race in Britain go unheard or are deemed too radical. Putting it in slightly exaggerated terms, there is now a gap between how white and non-white people often speak about race. Many black and minority ethnic people speak and think one way about race in their homes, with their families, or at the water cooler or in the toilets at work with colleagues from the same ethnic group, and speak differently in public or more generally in the workplace, having learned that certain language is viewed as too controversial, too radical, and with serious consequences for their ability to enjoy friendships or progress at work. And I think also for the honesty of our public debate. In responding to this dilemma, perhaps we can be inspired by and learn lessons from another anniversary, namely Martin Luther King's 50th anniversary year of the marches in Selma, Alabama. It's also the 50th anniversary of him speaking in St. Paul's Cathedral in 1964, December, on his way to Oslo to collecting the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a speech worth rereading, his speech to Britain in 1964, which I think was in the minds of those writing the 1965 legislation. Dr. King fully realized the need for white liberal allies, even as he also focused on black self-organization. So while we should not avoid calling out racism or highlighting that concepts such as white privilege and institutional racism have real explanatory power, we must also recognize that a decade and more of seeing the problem as solved means that many potential allies will be bewildered and upset by this analysis and will at least initially require a different form of messaging to bring them on board. This leads me to the third and final challenge, policy. One key issue here is data. And I know it's a bit unsexy and a bit boring, but there seems to be less commitment to collecting it. And I think it's relevant listening to Camilla that I do agree that the sort of sociological analysis and use of data is very much marks the British perspective on this from the 1960s. Having also Runnymede produced the Color and Citizenship Report, which was collected between 65 and 69 with Nicholas Deakin and Jim Rose collecting those data, and it was very influential on government thinking at the time. But without good data collection, we cannot measure and so evaluate the efficiency and equity of government policy and service delivery. However, data can't just be produced. It needs to be used effectively to hold government to account. It's no good to know that there's multiple spreadsheets at the ONS if they're not being used effectively to challenge and hold local and central government to account. However, from the comprehensive spending review to welfare reform to voting rights to apprenticeships to immigration, the previous government indicated the disproportionate effect of all of those policies, all of that legislation, on black and minority ethnic people, but failed to explain or justify these effects, merely counting it. Much less did it do anything to mitigate this predicted increase in racial inequalities. All of those measures had equality impact assessments, all of which indicated there would be a rise, and there was no mitigation. I think that also reflects the lack of serious political leadership on race. I'll take one recent example. In the 2015 general election campaign, David Cameron, in a speech in Croydon, a seat that the Conservative candidate won by only 150 votes and has the second most BME people of any Conservative seat, promised that 10% of apprenticeships would be black and minority ethnic people in the next Parliament. Well, that's a remarkably weak improvement on the 9.5% that went to BME people in the previous Parliament. But it's particularly weak when we consider that BME people are 26% of applicants for apprenticeships, and that many of us have been writing to the DWP and BIS about what they were going to do about it. Further, that BME people are 20% of the 18 to 24-year-old population. So his target is that BME people will be 2.5 times less successful in gaining apprenticeships. So while the Prime Minister argued in 2012 that smart people in Whitehall would never possibly allow policies to have unfair or unequal impact on ethnic minorities or other groups in a speech that dismissed equality legislation as so much red tape, his own target entrenches racial inequalities in the labor market. Either the Prime Minister and his aides are happy with this entrenchment of racial inequalities, or the people in Whitehall and the Cabinet are somewhat less clever than they think. They should then either take data collection and the equality duty more seriously, or perhaps employ and listen to people who actually know something about the impact of policy on disadvantaged groups. Another way to frame this point is to return to a question from the previous speaker, which is, do we still need further legislation in Britain? Or is the challenge implementing that legislation and generating enough public pressure on the government to implement policies that actually tackle racial inequalities? I think there was a case that we needed further legislation in the 60s, 70s, and 2010 and beyond. The question now is it legislation that's necessary to realize rights for black and minority ethnic people? So one possible policy push, so not so much legislation as policy, could be targets or positive action. I say this partly to be controversial and stir up debate, but also because there is actually a possibility that targets and positive action may be implemented. FTSE 100 companies appear somewhat willing at least to listen to a race target for their boards in much the same way they have done for women. Similarly, the judiciary may be willing or required to improve BME representation, and it's hard to see how the 17 black female professors can be improved upon, even in the medium term, without much more drastic action. Note here that while 18% of white women gain a first from our British universities, 6% of black women gain a first from those same universities. That underrepresentation is so severe, and the people on the next rung of the ladder too few, that it will take 50 or even 100 years for our institutions to reflect our society. All major British social institutions should therefore adopt a 10-year strategy to ensure that they better reflect the ethnic makeup of our society. For those who oppose to targets or positive or affirmative action, whatever you want to call it, the question is, what else do you propose to do, or are you satisfied to wait 50 years or more to remove racial inequalities? Now, targeted policies will not be easy to implement in Britain today, and not just because they are currently unpopular. 6% of white British people indicated that they were in favor of affirmative action in Britain, and only 20% of black and minority ethnic people. So clearly not a popular policy. Last year, over 100 BME people, but I don't think the challenge is just in the unpopularity. It gets back to the two previous challenges I raised, namely that of analysis and mobilization. Last year, over 100 BME people were appointed to the civil service fast stream, a significant improvement over the last 10 years. But only one black Caribbean and a handful of black African, Bangladeshi, and Pakistani people managed to secure a place. The beneficiaries were other minority ethnic groups who are doing relatively better in the labor market. This suggests that outreach or even affirmative action programs that have focused only on BME people generally, as a sort of large group, may not benefit those groups most underrepresented presently. To conclude, I believe we must continue to highlight and emphasize the role that race plays in determining the life chances of young and old BME people living in Britain. And when we analyze the issue, we cannot ignore color-based racism, not just in the memories of 80-year-olds born in Barbados, but 18-year-olds born in Birmingham, Bradford, and Belfast. There is an opportunity, however, now, both with new forms of mobilization and with the withering of traditional forms of influence in political parties and in Westminster, to come together on a common platform to reduce inequality and poverty generally in Britain. However, we should not underestimate this challenge, and not just because some powerful groups are hostile to it. We must be alive to the changes in how groups identify and experience life in Britain, not simply at a conceptual or mobilization level, but also in terms of how we design policy. Racism hasn't gone away, and our challenge for the next decade or more is to ensure that our message reaches the wider audience that Martin Luther King reached 50 years ago in Selma when faced with much steeper challenges. But I think if enough people mobilize, and if we clearly focus clearly and collectively on a few key issues rather than trying to change everything all at once, we'll make it more likely that a third and fourth generation of British-born BME people finally achieve equal opportunities with their white British peers, an ideal first theoretically articulated in the Magna Carta and then again in the Race Relations Act in 1965. Thank you.
I really would like to thank all of our speakers for 3 talks which managed to be thought-provoking and authoritative at the same time, which is quite an achievement, I think. We have time for questions and discussion. I think what I'd like to do is to gather up questions or comments and then in small groups and then ask our speakers to respond and then gather up another few. Yes, sir.
Yes. Is the group aware that the word race is in the law, but when you speak to organizations about race equality, they use words like ethnicity or equalities or diversity, but they didn't know. So, because I'm in the middle of this case at the moment, where race is one of the protected characteristics in the law, but nobody is doing any race relations work. They're not using that term. They use the words like diversity or equalities and so on. So they're afraid to use the word. And what reason do you think that is? Can the panel say?
Thank you very much. Right at the back, sir. Yes.
A question for Omar.
Hi, Kwaku.
No, I think we'll have to give up on the mic. So if you could.
I hope you can expatiate because I'm rather confused. You saying that race has gone up the ladder. I believe that's what you said. And if that's the case, I need some explanation because I don't think race is an issue talked about except in such gatherings.
And yes, madam. You, yes.
I'm not really sure what my question is, in the sense that I would like your opinions on the growth of UKIP, this idea of leaving the EU, and how that then relates to this Race Relations Act, and where we think Britain is going to, the type of Britain that we're going to see in 50 years' time if we see the rise of UKIP and the ending of the EU.
Okay, well, I think there's maybe quite a bit there. Not just there, but with the other questions as well. So, Omar, do you want to kick off and then?
Okay. Well, yes. I mean, Kwaku, I didn't understand. I didn't say it's moved up the ladder. I missed. Yeah, maybe I misspoke. I don't particularly think, as I was trying to argue, that race is particularly high up the policy agenda. No. But I mean, in terms of why race, I mean, I think I'd be interesting to hear your view. I mean, I think the way that it's now interpreted, especially by public bodies, is they just need to show that they've had due regard generally to equalities, and the sort of specificity on race is not viewed as necessary. But I'd be interested to hear your perspective on the issue of UKIP. I mean, obviously, we've got some data that suggests that only 2% of black and minority ethnic people voted for UKIP. So obviously they have questions about whether or not the perspective that UKIP takes on life and immigration in Britain. We're doing some research currently, focus groups on ethnic minority attitudes to immigration, so both settled communities and newer migrants. And I think one thing that has sadly penetrated, I think, widely is the concern that there's about benefits. And I'm quite surprised how many people express that concern in the sort of wider discourse of taking benefits falsely. However, I think one of the sort of points so I would sort of describe two elements of this sort of UKIP, but a sort of wider policy on discussion on immigration. One is the more socioeconomic competition for scarce resources and benefits, and the other is a cultural claim that we don't recognize things around here anymore, and things have changed far too much, far too quickly, and I don't recognize the country, and you can't play football in the streets anymore because there's too many black and brown faces or something like that. Obviously, that second kind of claim is hugely damaging, I think, for relationships between people from different backgrounds, and really turns off ethnic minority voters as well as makes them fearful, physically fearful for, I mean, some of the people we've been interviewing are scared about going in the streets, and they remember those statements. However, the socioeconomic statements, I think there is sort of more sympathy for that sort of claim. So I suppose it's up to UKIP to demonstrate that when they're making those claims, they're not, targeting particular groups or alienating or making the streets less safe for black and minority ethnic people. But I think that's all I'll say about that.
Camilla, do you want to
talk about UKIP?
or any of the other questions?
I think UKIP is probably where my expertise lies, unfortunately, because I've written a book about Enoch Powell. And I think that I have a real difficulty with sort of thinking historically about relating Powellism to UKIP, but I think in terms of my response to it and what I think needs to happen in response to UKIP is a much more a different type of kind of English, not nationalism but patriotism, which can kind of counter the UKIP claim for speaking for England. And I think the sort of there is an element of progressive Scottish nationalism which I think shows a sort of an alternative. And I actually I've been thinking about why there isn't a progressive English nationalism or patriotism that's alive today, a sort of sense of giving working class people and white working class people too a sense of kind of feeling a part of a community, committed politically, all of these things. So,
no Billy Bragg for you?
Well, Billy Bragg is a one-man band, but yeah.
Literally and metaphorically.
Yeah.
Anastasia.
So I think the story of UKIP shows really the changing nature of racism and the kind of new types of racism. Not that the old ones are completely redundant, but there are always these new types of prejudice we're having to deal with. And anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are perhaps one example, but the rise of UKIP to me is essentially anti-migrant. Well, my local UKIP candidate in Finchley and Golders Green boasted of having a British Asian wife, and I think the whole kind of dynamic changes, so they're not necessarily consider themselves to be threatening to black and ethnic minority people. They don't like the migrants, and a lot of the time it is white Eastern Europeans they're talking about. Again, not the kind of racism that we used to really think about. On the question of race, I think it is really interesting, and I have wondered that myself. And it seems that in the law, race and ethnicity are treated as completely interchangeable. And to my mind, that's just the kind of steering clear of the dodgy connotations of race. So already in the early 80s, Lord Denning talks about Jews being a race, but that's completely, was probably out of date even then. And I think there's a general sense that we don't want to talk about race. That has this.
Jews being classified as a race is not out of date.
I mean, the kind of right.
Yeah, I've got the files.
Right. Oh yeah. But the kind of these pseudo-scientific connotations to race, eugenics, and so on that we just don't want to get involved with. So, yeah, I wondered the same. I don't know.
Just two quick comments. I remember doing race training in the 1970s, and people would say I can't be racist because my wife or husband is black. So that's, I think, always been around as a reason for, or my neighbor is black, if we even wanted to go a bit further. Just a comment about UKIP. I think we have to remember what's happened to industry in this country and how things have changed so fundamentally in terms of people's worth, in terms of how the occupations they have. And we know there's been scale demolition of British industry. And so what that does to people, and replaced by not very good jobs, part-time jobs, 0-hour contracts, etc. So I think that will affect the way people feel about themselves, and inevitably about how they feel about other people who might be, or their perception that they are taking things that ultimately belong to me. And then if you mix in the press, which has a quite frightening power over us. I mean, in today's world, you don't even have to buy the Daily Mail or the Express. When you're buying another newspaper, you see what it has to say, and they are repeating the same arguments over and over again. So this combination of the loss of industry, of the power of the press, at the same time when we're facing many economic challenges, regardless of what the government has to say, it's a quite powerful mix that, you know, can help to propel a group like UKIP to bigger and better things in their mind.
Thank you. But we'll take another round. Julia, yeah.
Thank you very much for joining the papers.
You'll have to maybe stand up and speak up, Julia.
Absolutely. I just was wondering if you would also like to comment on some of the newer and subtler, but at the same time more mainstream forms of racism or religious prejudice directed at religious minorities. For instance, to take the example of the JFS that Anastasia mentioned, on the one hand, as you mentioned, this could indeed be seen as a happy day because a court case was won on the grounds that the school was indeed accused of racism. But at the same time, one can also conceptualize this whole case as the British society, the British court being racist and discriminatory against the Jewish community. Because as far as I remember, in that particular case, this particular Jewish school was compared to Catholic schools, saying that, look, a Catholic school is allowed to prioritize Catholic students, but they can't say, okay, if you're a Catholic from Britain, you're okay, if you're a Catholic from France, we're not going to take you. But again, what we clearly see here is the judge not being able to understand what it means to be Jewish, and that Judaism is not Christianity, and so we see this kind of under the radar Christianization of the minority community. But basically, like, the broader question is this kind of subtler forms of racism.
Thank you. Sir, yes.
Yes, I agree with you that race matters have somewhat gone lower on the agenda. I really do think that in relation to other forms of discrimination. But I don't think we should underestimate the normative effect of the law. And I think the law has, and the legislation has had a serious impact on the way that people do behave out there. There are, of course, some terrible incidents of racism, as we all know, but I do think, and I talk as an employment lawyer, but I do think that people do take much more seriously the question of racism, and they get much more worried about a finding of racism than they do of unfairness in dismissal. But my question goes back to you asking about, do we need more legislation? I'm going to ask you this question. Isn't the real issue in terms of enforcement, where the last government has abolished questionnaires in terms of claiming discrimination, and of course they've reduced the amounts available to the Equality Commission, but most importantly they have increased swingingly the fees for bringing a case in the Employment Tribunal. It's now virtually impossible for people to bring a case in the Employment Tribunal because of the tremendous costs, and I think that really is something that should be commented on.
Thank you. Sir.
I'd like to ask two questions, please. One is...
Briefly, please.
If you give me a chance, I will. How does the legislation relate to the Human Rights Act, and what will happen if that's reneged upon? And secondly, what impact can you say has the legislation had on schools?
Thank you. Madam, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to come back to UKIP, but I think it's quite important. Ford and Goodwin talked about the left behind, people that were left behind, the description of UKIP supporters. But the question is, isn't it correct that support for UKIP is highest in those areas where there are fewer immigrants? Because I think my understanding was that the voting pattern of the election was that where they had no contact with immigrants, that they had the support.
Thank you. Sir. Yeah.
I just wanted to go back. Hi, Omar.
Hi.
Sorry, I was head of the parliamentary bill team that amended the Race Relations Act in 2000. So I'm really interested in what Omar's been saying about do we need more legislation? Because one of the challenges we came up in framing that legislation was do we need new policies? And we concluded actually you don't need policies because all the policies were framed in 1976. What we needed was to compel public bodies to act. So, do we need more legislation? My answer to that would be definitely not. We need to compel people to abide by the legislation that's there to promote equality in the way that we've already set out. So, to go back to Omar's point, can you expand on what you mean by mobilisation? Because I think mobilisation, in order to compel political leaders to do the right thing, is an important part of this policy piece.
Yes. A last question.
Well, I'm from the Law Secular Society, and I don't agree with much of what's been said. I'd like to go back to the case of Mandela and Dao Lee, which deliberately conflated the issue of ethnicity and religion in a way which Parliament could not have intended in 1965 and 1968 Acts. What flowed from that legal case was a continuing blurring of the distinction between ethnicity and religion, which is leading to more and more demands and more claims of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, etc., sometimes overstated and sometimes completely untrue. When it comes to the conflation, the deliberate conflation between anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli opinion, well, I am pro-Palestinian, and I quite clearly see the complete and utter distinction between those two categories. Now, let's just go back to the JFS case. I actually I was the only non-Jew to address the Jewish Lawyers Conference on the JFS case, and my comments were well received, I'm glad to say. The JFS case has left the law unclear, because it has actually, although the right decision was reached in the case, the reasoning behind it was completely wrong. Because in fact, the technical detail is that the state, the court, was asked to pronounce on the process of conversion, on whether the conversion to Judaism was authentic or not. That was the real issue in the case. And I don't think the state should have any role in judging the religious validity of whatever religion one is. And that was the really regressive aspect of the case, to allow the state to interfere in the religious process. Obviously, as a secularist, I believe in the complete separation of the state from any religion. So I'd like your comments on that.
Thank you very much. Well, there's quite a lot there.
All on you.
You've got some legal stuff.
Edie, do you want to? Let's just
Yeah, I had three
go
comments,
along.
but I can't remember what the third one was. But you comment about that a non-Jewish person would have difficulty in understanding Jewishness. Well, lots of Jews have problems understanding Jewishness, so it isn't. And and this is a debate, and certainly the JFS case was hotly debated within the Jewish world, and will continue to be so, and future things as well. You comment about UKIP being popular in areas where there are few black and ethnic minority people. I think other research has also shown that there is less prejudice when people are living in areas with a whole diversity of people, and that should point the way to doing some positive things. I think when we talk about equality legislation, we have to also think that I think in many ways we're becoming a much more unequal society in a whole variety of ways, and this is going to impact on people. And the onslaught now against the Human Rights Act, how do we help to create a more positive culture about thinking that the Human Rights Act and everything it stands for, and equality and everything that that stands for, should be part and parcel of Britishness? And I think that's a real challenge, because the direction of travel, as we know, is in the wrong direction. And what are we going to do to bring it back to where it ought to be?
Anastasia?
Well, okay, there's quite a lot. Well, as to the JFS, I think you said something about new forms of prejudice. Well, I think it's nothing new, really. It's probably the first time it really came to the fore in the court. And yes, I completely agree. What we're talking about is a very Christian view of how faith schools should be operating. And that is why I think it's insufficient to talk of it in terms of racism only, because there's clearly a Christian or post-Christian dynamic at play. Yes, so Catholic schools are exemplary. They look at church attendance, so now synagogues have too. Also in Fraser, they kind of just can't get their head around that being attached to Israel is part of Judaism, and they don't give it any time whatsoever. It's again a very Christian view of religion, where you separate your spiritual attachment from everything material, and there's a lot to be said about that. And in terms of Mandela, well, in my view, the problem with it is the opposite, is that it artificially separates religion from ethnicity. It tells you have to tick the right box. It gives this definition of an ethnic group. If you qualify, you can use this act. If not, tough. So Jews and Sikhs were lucky enough to also be an ethnicity in that sense. So,
Human Rights Act.
Human Rights Act. Well, what will happen if that's repealed? I think the answer is nobody quite knows. I don't think anyone has thought it through. But
there's one person who has, who's Dominic Grieve. I mean, he spent a lot of time thinking it through, and he seems now to have changed his view. So. Well,
because they promised to replace it with something else, which would be in substance the same, except that we won't be bound by Strasbourg case law. Well, not to be bound by Strasbourg case law would mean pulling out of the European Convention on Human Rights, which I don't think was ever on the agenda explicitly, so it doesn't quite adapt. And yeah, well, there was a... Yeah, well, in terms of the normative effect of the law, that it's very difficult to bring an employment claim. Well, my partner is also an employment lawyer, and he is, because he defends the employer more often, he's rather rejoiced about the fees. However, I think my view, and he would probably agree, that a compromise should be reached, that fees at the current level are too high. Is it £1,200 or £1,500?
Two different. There's one for a hearing,
right.
One for bringing a case.
Yeah.
That's about 12, 13.
So that's clearly would bar most people from bringing claim. However, I think there should be a nominal fee to because there are a lot of unmeritorious claims that do waste everybody's time, but that bar shouldn't be set too high. I
think to answer your question, I think the normative power of the law is very important, but that shows to me an indication of why the law itself is not sufficient. I mean, we talk about equal rights, equal protection under the law, access to trial by jury, all of those things that we sort of see as coming down from deep principles, need further elaboration. And I think now it isn't about legislation. I do think it's about better policy making, but I don't see government being responsive unless they see a reason in terms of electoral politics. And that's why I was mentioning mobilization. I mean, first, I do think it's a genuine problem that I don't think black and minority ethnic people sort of come together under a common umbrella, and it's not just because people disagree. It's because it's unclear what that would look like. We don't have institutions. We don't have organizations that can so mobilize people. And one of the reasons I came to that reflection is, there's a lot of criticism about the sort of ideology of Conservative Party or the coalition or whatever, but you do see that these governments do have less legitimacy in a lot of ways in the eyes of the population. And so when they're against public opinion, they have to U-turn. And you saw that quite a lot under the coalition. And the forest sell-off was the one that sort of really struck me. And I realized that the major reason they turned around was because of the national trust. And so if we had a sort of national trust equivalent, they would listen more. And I think you're right. It would also sort of strengthen the interests of those civil servants who would like to see a better implementation. I mean, Lord Leicester, the sort of architect of the 76 bill, still complains today, he's alive, about the poor enforcement powers of the CRE in 1976. So, I mean, the disappointment in the sort of legislation dates not just from 65 and 68, but from the Superior 76 Act, and as you say, from the 2010 Act. I mean, one thing I did want to say is I was slightly involved in the early 2000s with the question of religion, and there were people who were trying to argue that Muslims were an ethnic and racial group, but it was an interesting, it failed for various reasons that you may be happy with, but it was kind of an interesting moment. I don't know. I feel like I've missed. There were a lot of questions. I mean, the only other thing I would say about UKIP. Sorry, I wanted to. In the Goodwin Ford book, the one other thing that I think Rob did in further research was there's a question asked in one of these surveys, do you think it would be better if Britain returned to the 1970s? It's that kind of question. Was Britain better in the 1970s? Would you rather live in the 1970s? And Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat voters, by 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, 4 to 1 in some cases, prefer to live today than 1970. I think the question was 1975 even, so not a particularly high point in British economic or social life. But UKIP voters, by a margin of 2 to 1, would prefer to turn back the clock to 1975. So there is that's an interesting, but it's also an interesting challenge. That in some ways, I think Rob has said this. What they're asking for is impossible to deliver. Even for UKIP. So it'll be interesting to see how Farage and the leadership negotiate that. Some of those demands are returning to an immigration situation, returning to a culture that would require the expulsion of 6 million people or 8 million people. It's not viable. It's not a policy that even, that anybody would ever sign up to.
I'll say something short. Well, the mid-70s were very socially equal, in fact.
Yeah, that's true. A high level. Yeah. That's true.
On your point about mobilisation, I think, and you mentioned it, this kind of idea of blackness as a collective identity. I mean, what that had in it was a radical political agenda as well. That wasn't. It wasn't about race only. It was about kind of Leninist politics. So I think that the kind of a possibility of mobilisation, speaking beyond the kind of multiracial, multicultural agenda, is to kind of fill it with politics and economics.
So there was a question about schools. Well, a lot of cases actually do concern schools, both students and teachers, both from Muslims and Jews, which is what I know most about. So there's a lot of uniform-related cases, as well as teachers.
The other bit, I suppose, is the curriculum. I wouldn't say it was I would say it's more about the normative issue. So I don't think schools adopted a sort of multicultural curriculum because the law required them to, but it did open up a space to ask questions about what does a fair education system for, ensuring that all young people derive some sort of. I mean, I think there's some sort of theory behind a lot of multicultural education that if Black and Asian people don't read about the contribution of Black and Asian people to civilization, to history, to Britain, that they will have less self-confidence and they will be less recognized as equal parts of the society. So there was I suppose there in that sort of philosophy, a notion that may have come out of a view of equality. What equality requires something a bit stronger than neutral institutions, but I don't think it was in any way required or followed from the law itself. And of course, there was a huge backlash with the Honeyford Ray Honeyford and all of that. And Michael Gove tried to change a lot, tried to get rid of Mary Seacole in the curriculum, for example. It's still a bit controversial. And I think that's also part of the problem with the black politics is it is very much associated with sort of loony left. And, not only the right attacks that, but the New Labour is very ambivalent about the relationship of, say, black party sections. And you see people like, Paul Boateng and Keith Vaz, who were, quite radical in the 80s, move into government, move into ministerial positions, and become part of New Labour apparatus. And there's a whole sort of tradition of criticizing that, but it's quite, I don't know if you have a view about that, but where that politics could now be situated is unclear to me, because there's not even much of it left in the Labour Party, much less across the political spectrum. I think that association with, I think unfairly and wrongly, with loony leftism and a lot of what I would say is sort of false myths, that black bin bags were banned and all of these kinds of stories, that Christmas is banned, all urban myths, but all very, very kind of powerful, and ones that I think New Labour in particular wanted to move away from, and it was one of the reasons they didn't talk about race as much, because of that association. Breaking with Clause 4 was also breaking with these other kinds of politics.
Edie, you wanted to say something. As it was your inspiration that gave us this evening, I think you should have the last word.
Oh gosh, no, that's a challenge I can't really rise to. Before that, just to say that this identification with Israel is not something that's universally shared by all Jewish people, and there's a lot of diversity within the Jewish world about understanding and attachment to Israel in terms of Jewish identity, as there is within Muslim communities and our other communities. There's a lot of diversity in terms of how we feel people, we feel people are attached to. But just to say, delighted that this event took place. As we know, we don't see many references in the newspapers to the 1965 Act, and how we embed this into our thinking about trying to become a more positive, equal, and just society, and the role that the 1965 Act played in that. It wasn't the full answer, obviously, but it was a part of that. And it's, I think, about going back and remembering important milestones within our history, our experience, our tradition, and celebrating those, and making sure that we continue to follow those up in creating the sort of society many of us would like to see happen. So thank you all very much for your participation. Thank you to the Pears Institute for doing all the hard work in creating this evening, and to you for your participation.
I'd like to thank all of you who came along this evening. Those of you who asked questions and made comments especially. I apologise to those of you who had questions or comments and didn't have a chance to articulate them. Even more, I'd like to thank all of our panellists for speaking really and raising so many extremely troubling questions. I mean, I go away thinking that what we need is more enforcement, more mobilization, and as someone who works in a university, I'm glad to say more research. But I'd like to thank all our speakers very much indeed.